Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch event for Volume 45, Issue 4 of the University of New South Wales Law Journal. On behalf of the Journal, I would like to begin tonight's proceedings by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather here this evening. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us for this occasion. My name is Darius Dadgosta, and I'm the Executive Editor of the University of New South Wales Law Journal. It is a privilege to welcome everyone here tonight at Botanic House to the launch event for Volume 45, Issue 4 of the UNSW Law Journal, the journal's final launch event this year. Tonight's launch event would not be possible without the generous support of Cause Chambers Westgarth, the UNSW Law Journal's newest premier sponsor. The Journal is very grateful for this burgeoning relationship, which will no doubt strengthen the Journal's status as one of Australia's leading academic law reviews, and looks forward to collaborating with Cause Chambers Westgarth for many years in the future, including on future launch events at Cause's new state-of-the-art Sydney office at Quay Quarter Tower. I would like to thank in particular Ms. Marianne Saliba and Ms. Cassandra Galea for their assistance in helping organise tonight's launch event, and Andrew Corbell, partner at Cause Chambers Westgarth, who will be speaking on behalf of the firm shortly. I would also like to thank the Journal's other premier sponsors, Allens, Herbert Smith Freehills and King & Wood Mallisons, for their invaluable support over the past few decades. Issue 45.4 of the UNSW Law Journal is a general issue containing 12 articles that explore an array of legal topics. I would like to thank all of the authors featured in Issue 45.4, some of whom are here this evening, for entrusting the Journal with their insightful scholarly works and meaningfully contributing to discourse on critical legal issues. I would like to acknowledge in particular UNSW Scientia Professor Jane McAdam, whose article exploring how Australia's evacuation laws can better incorporate human rights principles to prevent arbitrary displacement when natural disasters occur, inspired the theme of tonight's launch event: Climate Justice and Displacement. I would like to welcome Ms. Fleur Ramsay, Head of Litigation and Climate Lead for the Pasifika Program at the Environmental Defender's Office, for joining us this evening to deliver tonight's highly anticipated keynote address on the theme of climate justice and displacement. Congratulations are now in order for Georgia Fink-Brigg, the editor of Issue 45.4, for working so tirelessly in coordinating the peer review and editing of the articles in this issue. Seeing an entire issue through to publication is a remarkable achievement, and the editorial board is very proud of how Georgia has worked throughout this process with such diligence and positivity. Congratulations are also in order for the General Editorial Board. Your many hours of meticulous editing and legal research are truly admirable and are what have ensured the Journal's continued sterling reputation in the legal community. I must also especially thank the Journal's Executive Committee. It has been a privilege leading and working alongside you this year to implement policies and initiatives to elevate the Journal and its reputation, some of which include the expansion of the Journal's editorial board to facilitate the growth of the Journal, the introduction of audiovisual content on the Journal's forum, the streamlining of the Journal's peer review and editing processes, and the promotion of diversity within the Journal's editorial board, and in terms of the authorship, subject matter, and theoretical approaches of the legal scholarship that the Journal publishes. I would like to acknowledge outgoing forum editor Isabel Wainwright and digital editor Callum Brunton for their commendable service on the Executive Committee, and welcome next year's Executive Editor Matilda Grimm, Forum Editor Jack Zhou, Digital Editor Zong Guan, Issue Editor Anna Ho, and Interim Editor of Submissions Brad Marzol. The Journal will be in great hands next year. Last but not least, I'd like to thank the UNSW Faculty of Law and Justice, particularly the faculty's Dean, Professor Andrew Lynch, who will be delivering a vote of thanks later this evening, and faculty advisors Professors Gary Edmond and Rosalind Dixon for their steadfast support of the Journal and editorial board. It is greatly appreciated. It is now my pleasure to invite Andrew Corbell, partner at Cause Chambers Westgarth, to speak on behalf of the firm. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Darius, and good evening, everyone. As Darius said, I'm a partner of CAUSE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the partners and staff at CAUSE, some of whom hopefully you've had the chance to mingle with and meet before the start of the event. We're really pleased and proud to be a premier sponsor of the UNSW Law Journal. It's a great opportunity for us to be associated with what we think is an outstanding institution within the legal and academic communities of Sydney, and we think it's a perfect match for the kind of firm that we are and exactly the kind of activity that we want to be associated with. So thank you for having us on board as one of your premier sponsors, and as Darius said, I hope that we have a long and healthy relationship together. I have absolutely no say in whether or not that's so, but if it's up to me, it'll happen. The next time we host you, I can assure you we will have you up to our sparkling new offices in Quay Quarter Tower. We just weren't quite sure when we were going to be in there or if we were going to be in there this year, so it didn't quite happen in time. But I'm pleased that we're having you here because this is just such a beautiful part of Sydney. It really is an amazing place to come and sit, particularly at this time of night, and look out and if you're bored at hearing someone like me speak, you can look out the window and see the tranquil surrounds and feel serene. So we're pleased to have you here. I'm joined here tonight by our Sydney partner in charge, James Abbott, our head of corporate, Sandy Mack, and we did have our head of restructuring, Cameron Cheetham, who's also our head of graduate and summer clerk recruitment, who hopefully some of you got the chance to meet earlier in the evening. He's had to duck off now. For our part, we'd like to congratulate all of the authors and editors who've been involved in the preparation of Volume 45, Issue 4. We recognise the enormous amount of work that has gone into the preparation of each of the diverse articles in this issue and the contribution that each of them, and the journal more broadly, makes to the legal community. I'm particularly looking forward to hearing from the keynote speaker, Fleur, talking tonight on the topic of climate justice and displacement. Climate litigation is an area of interest that I've had the privilege to write and present on as a member of our firm's ESG practice group over the last few years. And I can tell you that we and our clients are highly engaged with the many implications of the climate emergency. But I do recognise the really important role that the EDO and similar organisations are playing in pressing at the boundaries of the law to respond to the emerging issues that are associated with climate change, which are often, in fact, almost always unprecedented. And we all benefit as lawyers and as a society in an exchange of views about these issues and what our obligations are or should be in light of them. So on that note, thank you again to the Law Journal for the opportunity to host this launch, and I'd like to hand over to the editor of this issue, Georgia Finkbrigg.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was such a wonderful introduction, and we're so thrilled to be working with you. So I'd also like to start by acknowledging country. We're on the beautiful Gadigal land today, and I'm an uninvited settler on these lands, which are sovereign and always was and always will be Aboriginal. I remember sitting in the audience at one of these events a few years ago, quite a while before I joined the UNSW Law Journal, and I kind of thought to myself, like, this event is where the bulk of the journal's work must go. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong, as is clear from the laughter in this room, because many have worked on this journal. So issue 45.4 is the product of thousands of hours of work, and tonight's like these are just a chance to try and acknowledge the work that went into this and the wonderful articles themselves. So the work starts with the 19 authors in this issue. Thank you so much for allowing us to shepherd your excellent, meticulous work to publication. Some of you are here with us tonight, and it's been so lovely meeting with you and a pleasure working with you. When you kind of think about it, student-run law journals are quite strange. Like, here we are at the very beginning of our legal careers, editing the work at the absolute cutting edge of legal knowledge. And this dynamic only works because of the generosity of our peer reviewers who dedicate their time to give very insightful comments that make these excellent articles in this issue even better, and we're so grateful for their wisdom. Speaking of wisdom, thank you to our faculty advisors, Professors Rosalind Dixon and Gary Edmond. You approach the problems the Executive Committee comes to you with logic, with empathy, and we really value your expertise. Along with the Faculty of Law and Justice and our Dean Andrew Lynch, who's here tonight, we feel really deeply the way you value our independence and just the value you place in the journal itself. So thank you so much, because we couldn't do this without you. Yeah, absolutely. We also couldn't run without the support of our premier sponsors, which Darius has touched upon, but I wanted to say an extra thanks to Cause Again for hosting this wonderful evening in this beautiful location. Editing a journal, as is clear from tonight, is truly a community effort. So each article in the issues you have in your hands is looked over by at least 5 editors who pore over their contents. They verify every single proposition. I think we give the New Yorker fact checkers a run for their money. So thank you so much for your encyclopedic knowledge of the Australian Guide to Legal Citation. There is nobody else I would rather debate Oxford commas with. It's been such a thrill to return to in-person events this year, and I really feel the vibrancy of our community as we're seeing each other back in person. So thank you for your hard work and, most importantly, for your friendship. As Darius spoke about, equity and diversity of both the editorial board and our authors and the contents within our issues have been something that's really played on the minds of recent executive committees. An important component of equity is time. I'm very privileged to have the discretionary time to commit to taking on a role like this, but we know that caring responsibilities, disability, full-time work, economic hardship, among so many other factors, make it much harder for people to take on the time to volunteer for positions like this. So I'm really proud of the work the Executive Committee has done to try and lessen the very intense workload of all of us here by increasing the size of our editorial board and reducing the amount of footnotes in a given article by putting in some footnote limits. So issue 4 editors have the longest tenure on the journal, which is the best and the worst part of the role. I've been very privileged to work across 2 excellent executive committees over the last 15 months. So thank you so much to the transformative executive committee of last year, volume 44, particularly Alicia, Tina and Caitlin, who are somewhere in the crowd. You've all evaded retirement and supported this issue, and I'm so grateful. To Kari, the editor of issue 45.1, you inspired me to run over a lockdown walk, and you've supported me ever since, and I'm so grateful. To my issue editor buddies, Enrico, Hayden, Akriti, who's not here with us tonight because she's on exchange, and Hayden. We've been in the trenches together, and I thank you so much for your friendship and your encouraging high-angle selfies. A special thank you to our forum editor, Isabel Wainwright, not only for their friendship and company in the office, but their contribution to the journal. So for anyone who doesn't know, the forum is the online companion to the UNSW Law Journal, and this year we did publish our first YouTube video content, which is great. I all suggest you look at it. Izzy's also arranged social events and helped us all out on our edits for our issue. So we couldn't have done this without you, Izzy. Thank you also to our executive editor, Darius, who's the best editor I know. Thank you to Callum Brunton, our digital editor. You both keep the journal engine running, and I'm so grateful. I really know that together as a team, there's no problem the executive committee can't handle, and this issue is the product of our collaboration and of our friendship, and it's been such an honour to be part of this team. And I know the journal's in very safe hands with next year's executive, particularly if Anna's amazing citation memes are anything to go by. Thank you to my wider community, my dear friends, many of whom are here tonight, my family and my partner. This issue could not have been made without your love and support. And a final thank you, because there are so many, and I'm still sure I'm forgetting people, but a final thank you just to everyone here in this room, because if you're here, whether you're an author, an editor, keynote speaker, you're a supporter of the UNSW Law Journal, and you make this publication possible, so thank you so much. Please, yeah. I do want to spend a moment on the content itself before I know Fleur will give her wonderful keynote. General issue editors have a very daunting undertaking, which is to try and come up with a theme based on the really varied articles in their issue. So the theme selected for this launch was climate justice and displacement, but there are countless others that could have been chosen. One of them could have been about technology in the law. So for those who are interested in technology, may I recommend Parasol's article, which examines the denial of banking services to cryptocurrency providers, which is very timely in light of the recent collapse of FTX, a cryptocurrency exchange in the US. Parasol advocates for the development of an anti-money laundering compliance framework, specifically for crypto providers. Other articles examine the recently introduced consumer data right and facial recognition technology, and I only hope technology regulators take very good notice. This issue also contains really insightful examinations of international law. So Sebesvi argues that foreign intellectual property judgments should be recognised in more circumstances, while Karen Ratnam outlined the failure of the Family Law Act to adequately protect Indigenous children's right to cultural safety through their comparative analysis of New Zealand's family laws. Again, we have so many other articles. I think there's really something in here for everyone. We have articles on academic freedom, bisexual erasure, human-centred design in tribunals, the interpretation of the Corporations Act. So I highly recommend you read them all. Turning to the theme of this launch, which was climate justice and displacement. This responds to Jane McAdam's article. Professor McAdam reflects on the recent extreme weather events in Australia, the Black Summer bushfires and the recent flooding, which resulted in mass evacuations. She examines Australia's evacuation laws critically through a human rights lens, and she finds that our laws often fail to understand evacuations as what they are, which is internal displacement. People are often displaced from their homes for weeks to years. The theme, climate justice and displacement, also recognises two other threads which travel through this issue. The first is a sense of justice. So this is captured in Karen Ratnam's article about cultural safety and an article in this issue which examines the implementation of a family violence scheme which prevents survivors from being cross-examined by abusers in family courts. On the theme of displacement, another thread running through this issue, Wolf examines the barriers to registration for refugee doctors during World War II. Climate justice recognises that climate change and displacement are fundamentally issues of justice or injustice. As McAdam's article demonstrates, climate crises don't impact everyone evenly. Indigenous peoples, people with disability, children are disproportionately impacted by climate-induced displacement. And by the way, Professor McAdam sends her apologies. She really wanted to be here tonight, but the Caldor Centre is co-hosting an event with Buruz Buchani, so I think it's a very worthy absence. So climate change is also integrally tied to the forces of injustice discussed in other articles in this issue, including colonial expansion and domestic violence, with climate change-induced crises increasing the incidence of violence against women and girls. It's my absolute privilege to introduce Fleur Ramsay, who is delivering the keynote on this theme entitled Decolonising Climate Displacement. Fleur is the head of litigation and climate lead for the Pasifika Program at the Environmental Defender's Office. The program partners with local organisations to protect the environment and the human rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the Pacific. The program engages with international mechanisms and laws with the aim to ensure that states meet their legal obligations to the environment and to communities. Fleur is an expert in Indigenous rights and environmental law and their intersection, and is an experienced litigator. Prior to joining the Environmental Defender's Office, Fleur was a visiting international attorney in the international group at Earth Justice, a barrister, a solicitor in the environmental group at Allens Linklaters, and in 2015 she was a consultant and undertook training with for lawyers with the Samoan Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. She is also a member of the UNSW Law faculty. She's currently studying a PhD candidate at UNSW. As well as bringing extensive domestic and international legal experience, Fleur is Samoan and brings a personal understanding of the Pacific, and it's a pleasure to introduce her to deliver this keynote. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So first I wanted to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also recognise that this is stolen land and that sovereignty was never ceded to the Crown. Thank you for inviting me tonight, and I'm really happy to be here, and I also recognise that there's a wonderful backdrop for this talk. So I just wanted to start with being explicit about my standpoint. I am a Samoan who has adopted a decolonial approach to my practice as an environmental lawyer. My work and the work of the Pasifika Program at the Environmental Defender's Office involves supporting partner organisations and local communities in the Pacific region to defend their environment and culture against destructive, extractive processes and climate change. What does it mean to adopt a decolonial approach as an environmental lawyer? It essentially means three things. First, it involves developing an analytical framework to understand the forces at work that are driving the ecological and climate crisis in the Pacific region. This is essential work because without a proper diagnosis, our solutions are not adequate to the task. The analytical framework that I've developed, you probably won't be surprised, is colonisation. I have been heavily influenced by Patrick Wolf's brilliant analysis that colonisation is not an event, it is a structure. There is a tendency to think of colonisation as a one-off or superseded event such as annexation. However, it is an ongoing process with a structuring logic. For Wolf, that structuring logic, i.e. what colonisation involves, is the elimination of the native. This is aimed at securing, that is, obtaining and maintaining territory. The elimination of the native can happen in various ways, such as through genocide, residential schools, reserves, mass incarceration, extractivism, the breaking down of native title into individual freehold, religious conversion, child abduction, etc. And I am arguing in this paper that climate change is another way. Wolf gives the example of blood quantum to determine who is Indigenous, which is designed to reduce the numbers of Indigenous peoples with claims to land. An obvious example in Australia is an adequate connection to land, not sufficiently native, because of dispossession, and thus enacts an extinguishment of native title. Colonisation continues to exist as a structure despite formal decolonisation of the islands where we work in the Pacific. It is easier to accept this statement in those parts of the Pacific where decolonisation as a formal process has not occurred. Putting aside the settler colonies of Australia and New Zealand, this includes New Caledonia, Hawaii, French Polynesia, American Samoa, Guam, the Commonwealth of the Mariana Islands and West Papua. Our Pasifika program works predominantly in self-governing sovereign countries of Vanuatu, Fiji, Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. We have also previously worked with Tuvalu, which is also a self-governing sovereign state. Clearly, I recognise that these countries have gained independence, and I think it would be highly reductive, offensive, and incorrect to say that these countries are still colonised. Many of these countries suffered under colonial occupation and administration, fought for, and are proud of their independence. But in my experience as a practitioner working in this region, the logic of elimination of the native still plays out in these countries in various ways as well. Thus, this analytical tool is not just relevant to the settler colonial context, which was Patrick Wolf's focus. For example, our program works in Papua New Guinea, which is home to the third largest rainforest in the world. Not many people are aware of that. Most land and forests are under customary title and are protected under Papua New Guinea's constitution. It is not contested that the forests are owned by Indigenous landowners. Despite this, we are witnessing large-scale modern land theft. I'm yet to see a forestry concession, and I've looked at a lot of them, which is a legal permission to log, which was lawfully obtained. This theft is enabled by Western concepts of property, like Torrens title, leases and licenses, which is entirely at odds with customary title and the customary governance of land. Indeed, the Torrens system in Papua New Guinea extinguishes customary law, the traditional way that land is dealt with and has been dealt with for thousands of years. I might add that this push to change land tenure was driven by the World Bank, who saw these Indigenous lands as lying idle and unproductive and called for their mobilisation, taking us back to John Locke's justifications for land theft. Locke argued that Indigenous tenure was unproductive land and wasteland, especially where there was no obvious use of the lands and not property, and thus could be possessed by Europeans. Thus, why I'm cautious about not overworking the concept of colonisation, this logic of elimination is something that occurs in post-colonial countries in the Pacific. This persistence of colonisation may not be an overarching structure vis-a-vis Indigenous peoples as in the settler colonial context, but colonial processes still persist. Anne Stoller's concept of imperial debris is useful here, which recognises that in many places which are post-colonial in a formal sense, there is still perceptible colonial aftermaths. Much like ruins or debris, colonial processes may exist in a more fragmented form or are uneven but nevertheless are still present and endure. The second method that I use as a decolonial environmental lawyer is the approach I take to these ongoing colonial processes and adopts and builds on Yang and Tuck's view that decolonisation is not a metaphor and requires the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. However, in the Pacific, we need to modify this definition of decolonisation to include the defence of Indigenous land and life, so defending rather than repatriating, because across the Pacific, land is still largely in the hands of Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples. That is, through communal and customary title. As I've already discussed, there are processes underway to change this, particularly in the World Bank's term to mobilise land for international capital and to make land productive. I would also add to Yang and Tuck's definition the need to repatriate and defend Indigenous law, noting that in the Pacific, customary law is recognised as law and is enforceable as law in many Pacific legal systems. This is obviously in stark contrast to settler colonial contexts. And I should say that even though customary law is recognised in many state systems, it's still largely untested, which is something that the Pasifika Program wants to change. So, for example, we work with communities along the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea who are defending their river from a tailings dam, which will be just over twice the size of Sydney Harbour and located in the Ring of Fire a seismically active area, threatening catastrophic loss of life if the dam breaks. And the Papua New Guinea government does not have capacity to maintain that dam in perpetuity. We're working with communities to defend the river using their own customary understandings of the river to protect it as an ancestral being with the right to life. And we will test this in the state's courts to see to what extent the state can recognise this different way of thinking about the river. This brings me to my third point. To be a decolonial environmental lawyer is to incorporate Indigenous worldviews and perspectives into your work. This, in fact, needs to be the starting point. Environmental lawyers in the Pacific need to be careful not to impose imperial concepts. Even environmental law itself is an example of an imperial concept. Environmental law is premised on the separation of nature and culture, which does not exist in the worldviews and perspectives of Indigenous peoples. What exists is a total environment which contains the entirety of the world. For example, in Samoa, we have a story of Sina and the tuna, which means eel. Tuna fell in love with Sina when she would bathe in the freshwater pool and chased her across Savaii, the island where my mum was from, all the way to Upolu and to Moata'a, where my auntie lives. The warriors of this village slayed the tuna for her. Before they killed him, he declared his love for Sina one more time, telling her to have the warriors chop off his head and bury it, which they did. In that place, the first coconut tree grew. The coconut has 3 holes. If you look at the coconut, you'll see they've got 3 holes, the eyes and mouth of the eel, so that Sina's ancestors to this very day kiss the eel when they drink coconut water and are nourished by the eel's love. Samoans are thus genealogically and poetically involved in our ecology. The depth of this understanding reveals the world to us and deepens our engagement in it. Further, on a more practical level, many of the legal systems that work in the Pacific have modelled their environmental laws on Australia's or New Zealand's laws. I often criticise this because these laws are not working in either Australia or New Zealand. In any event, where both countries are facing ecological crises. Moreover, such an imperial approach fails to recognise that customary laws could be seen as a form of environmental law, which is appropriate to the conditions of the Pacific and for the communities that created these laws. And across the Pacific, a lot of communities use taboo to prohibit people from fishing in a particular place. It becomes sacred, and then that area can rejuvenate. So there is a form of law that works on a customary level. So with this foregrounding, what does it mean to decolonise climate displacement in relation to the Pacific? There are 3 points that I want to make. First, I argue that what we are in fact seeing in the Pacific is climate dispossession rather than climate displacement. I understand that displacement is a term used in relation to refugees and refers to someone who has been forced to flee their home, and can refer to internally displaced persons or externally displaced persons, and the externally displaced person crosses an international border. But displacement leaves unsaid the cause of the displacement. I think that dispossession, which is the act of depriving a person or peoples of their land or property, more accurately describes the process of climate change in the Pacific. It also brings to the forefront what is at stake for the communities who are forced to leave their ancestral homes. For the Pacific, climate change is a type of theft, dispossessing us of our vital spaces, and is a colonial process. We can see the evolution of this in action in statements made by Pacific countries during the Conference of the Parties, or COPs, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where Pacific states are consistently demanding that industrialised and wealthy countries act in a manner consistent with preserving their islands and cultures. They also put the rest of the world on notice of the impacts that they were already experiencing, which was serious. They were under no illusions that wealthier or industrialised countries needed to take the lead and reduce their emissions. These wealthier countries had the power to act. The Pacific countries recognised that they were powerless to do anything about the problem because their emissions are negligible. They did not cause the problem. So I'm going to read some statements from COP, and these start when our temperature, the temperature rise was 0.5. At COP2 in 1996, a representative from Kiribati said, "Here at this conference, we sense a feeling of common purpose. It is the purpose to ensure that the objectives of the Framework Convention on Climate Change shall be met. However, we always wonder with anxiety whether these objectives would be realistic for low-lying coral atolls, given the continuing prediction of the IPCC, which is the scientific body, on the sea level rise, whilst there appears to be no set timetables to limit and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from the industrialised countries. Serious coastal erosion is experienced on many of our atolls. It has affected the people's livelihood, and people in certain villages are already accommodating the change of the coastal profiles of their atolls. Certain villages are already retreating further inland. We keep wondering whether sea level rise has not already been rising and that coastal erosion experience is not the consequence of rising sea level." The following year in 1997, at COP3, the representative of Kiribati said, "The future of my country depends on international efforts to address climate change issues. We are frequently experiencing high spring tides that have caused extensive erosion and overtopping of our coastal areas. Salt water intrudes into our precious and limited groundwater lens. Coconut trees fall into the seas, breadfruits and taros are destroyed." And I should say, it may seem insignificant, but coconut trees take about 100 years to grow. So it's actually highly significant. They are the main crops that they have thrived in the rather dry climate and sandy soils of our atolls. Moreover, houses fall into the sea, and some people have had to move further inland, a few hundred metres width of the land. Parts of our roads have been realigned as the sea continues to encroach on land. Seawalls are frequently destroyed, and our people are putting up sandbags on land in front of their houses to protect them from inundation and overwash during high spring tides. But how has the international community been responding to what we all recognise to be a common and serious threat to our planet? It is business as usual. That is, we have allowed the course of events to proceed, knowing full well that the results are going to be destructive for all of us. Why are we hesitating to address climate change and to make real commitments to check and reverse the trend? Of course we know the answer. Industrialised countries should take the lead in this effort and take on commitments to reduce their emissions. What the representative from Kiribati makes clear is that they could already see the impacts of climate change on their islands, forcing people to move away from their ancestral lands, and this corresponds to the business as usual, or as I argue, acting in a manner which reinforces this dispossession. In the same conference in 1997, after repeating their concerns about the climate impacts that they were already experiencing, particularly coastal erosion, Kiribati asked, "Of course we have been saying these things, but who cares?" Samoa was also under no illusion about the failure of industrialised and wealthy countries to take serious action and that they were powerless to address the problem. At COP3 in 1997, Samoa said, "Acting alone, we are powerless to safeguard the future of our peoples from a problem they had no part in creating. No party should contemplate loss of whole societies with indifference. We, the small island developing states, are the first to be affected by the consequences of climate change and the least able to adapt. Sea level rise poses the most profound danger. It erodes already scarce land territory, threatens our reefs and evades our precious groundwater. By COP25, so many, many years later, in 2019, with temperature rise now locked in at 1.1 degrees Celsius, Samoa was clearly exasperated and said, "What goes around comes around." And while Samoa and small island developing states are victims now of the impacts of climate change, as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, your turn will come sooner rather than later. Samoa also raised the continued failure of these wealthy and industrial countries to act, and the denials from these countries that there was indeed a problem. Samoa calls this out for what it is, an intentional tactic to not act to mitigate climate change, or, putting it another way, acting in a way which continues to cause dispossession across the Pacific. In the words of the Samoan representative, when Samoa and SIDS, small island developing states, that's what SIDS means, told the world early that their coastlines were eroding, the sea level was rising and climate change was humanly induced, some member states scorned at the notion and did not take our concerns seriously. Instead, they asked for scientific evidence to back up our claim as a convenient stalling tactic to frustrate our resolve. Yet, when the world's top scientists, including the report on the imperative of keeping global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, some countries refuse to accept the evidence and still use every opportunity to discredit such reports. I wanted to read these statements in full because they are powerful. What we can see clearly from the earliest COP and over a 30-year period, the Pacific were warning the powerful players that only they could act to prevent climate harm in the Pacific region. They knew who was responsible for that harm. This is consistent with attribution science, where we can point specifically to the countries and players fueling this crisis. For example, the United States is responsible for 20% of all cumulative emissions, and the European Union is responsible for 17%. 90 transnational corporations, 90, predominantly headquartered in the global north, are responsible for 63% of cumulative industrial emissions from the period 1751 to 2010. We are now at a point where 1.5 degrees Celsius is being characterised as impossible. The foot is firmly placed on the accelerator. Current commitments made under the Paris Agreement will far exceed the 1.5 degrees, which is the red line for the Pacific. It is what we have said is the line beyond which our very survival is threatened. Warming at no more than 1.5 degrees is our human right. Current commitments get us closer to 2.8 degrees Celsius. And if you read the science, you should be alarmed. I do not want to rehearse the science of climate change, except to say that many scientists consider that even at 1.5 degrees Celsius, temperature rise will be catastrophic globally, and not just in the Pacific. At 1.5 degrees, the Pacific will lose 99% of its reefs. 99%. Our tuna, not the eel, but the fish, will migrate from our waters towards the east because of the warming of our seas. Exceeding 1.5 degrees is truly an existential crisis for some Pacific states and many Pacific communities. Low-lying island states like Kiribati and Tuvalu face complete inundation from the sea, complete disappearance. They risk losing their statehood and maritime boundaries, including their exclusive economic zone, which is their only source of income that they have beyond aid. And this is because of a narrow definition in international law of statehood as requiring territory, and territory means land. In other words, entire populations will be dispossessed of their lands and their ocean territories. Despite all of this, the fossil fuel industry is signalling that they intend to continue to extract fossil fuels and are calling on governments to drop pursuing efforts to meet the 1.5 degrees target. While there is a pathway to 1.5, it involves no new fossil fuel projects and a phase out of current fossil fuel projects in line with the target. On 10th of August of this year, The Guardian reported that Tamboran Resources, a gas company with interest in the proposed mega gas field in the Northern Territory's Beetaloo Basin, had called on the newly elected federal government to abandon the unattainable goal of limiting average global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees. The company has received a $7.5 million incentive from the previous federal government to explore the Beetaloo Basin for gas. For Tamboran Resources, this goal stood in the way of the development of a climate-safe gas industry, which would reduce emissions by supplanting coal, but apparently not reduce emissions enough to limit warming to 1.5 or to keep the Pacific climate safe. In early November this year, the CEO of Santos, Kevin Gallagher, told investment analysts in Adelaide that a decade of climate wars and energy policy failure, more than Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have left Australia without affordable and reliable energy. Energy policy globally and in Australia is at, in Gallagher's words, a very dangerous tipping point. He called on federal and state governments to put their shoulder to the wheel to develop more gas supplies. The future, he told his audience, is decarbonisation and not defossilisation. To support this vision of a continued place for fossil fuels, he pointed to the International Energy Agency's STEP scenario, which in 2050 has hydrocarbons providing 60% of the world's energy, requiring the continued exploitation of gas. The STEP scenario is what the IEA, so the International Energy Agency, euphemistically calls a conservative scenario and has us on a trajectory of close to 3 degrees Celsius. So it is not surprising that at the most recent COP27, which I attended, had 636 fossil fuel lobbyists as part of country delegations, far exceeding all the combined delegates from small island developing states. For some states attempted, and it's not surprising that some states attempted to drop efforts to pursue the commitment to 1.5 degrees Celsius and signalling that they intend to exceed this red line. The next COP is going to be interesting. These are intentional decisions that are being made with full knowledge of the consequence. A recent report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances, it's a long title, has called out these intentional decisions as the creation of sacrifice zones, which includes the ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples and the territories of small island developing states, rendering our region dangerous and even uninhabitable due to environmental degradation. She notes that these sacrifice zones are concentrated in a formerly colonised territories of the global south, and the global north is largely to blame for these conditions. In the Special Rapporteur's words, the primary beneficiaries of these racial sacrifice zones are transnational corporations that funnel wealth towards the global north and privileged national and local elites. Notwithstanding this, she notes that an approach that takes into account racial injustice in the global framework remains thoroughly marginalised. Environmental injustice, climate and racial injustice, she concludes, are the institutionalised status quo, sidelining the interests and concerns of non-white peoples within the UN frameworks for coordinating global response to the environmental crisis. In my view, Pacific peoples are not facing climate displacement. This is a new wave of colonial dispossession. The second point that I want to make about what it means to decolonise climate displacement is that while it is capable of recognising that there will be loss and damage when a person or peoples are displaced, decolonising displacement forces us to contend with the loss and damage that Indigenous peoples face as Indigenous peoples. While we might use displacement in Australia to describe people who lost their homes in Lismore during the floods and are now facing the prospect of relocating, the loss and damage that Indigenous people face is on an entirely different scale when displaced from their ancestral lands. Loss and damage for Pacific peoples is tied to the importance of our vital spaces, which is tied to language, identity, and well-being, which is an entire cosmos and world. Our traumas and losses are holistic, affecting the whole fabric of our being and our communities. Samoans have a word, fa'a sing no manga, which captures the essence of connection and the essence of identity which is embedded in our territories and relationships bound up with these territories. The significance of fa'a sing no manga is encapsulated in the words of Paramount Chief and former head of state of Samoa, Tuiatua Tapua Tamasese Efi. I am not an individual. I am an integrated part of the cosmos. I share divinity with my ancestors, the land, the seas, and the skies. I am not an individual because I share a tofi, inheritance, with my family, my village, and my nation. I belong to my family, and my family belongs to me. I belong to my village, and my village belongs to me. I belong to my nation, and my nation belongs to me. This is the essence of my sense of belonging. Indigenous languages, practices, stories, proverbs, poetry, art are derived from place. We are ecologically derived cultures. Our cultures bring to life and engage the senses. I will give you some examples of how language can produce effective bonds between people and our lands. Tuiatua discusses how trees are sentient. The Samoan word to cut down a tree is oia, derived from oi, which is to cry out in pain. Blood and mud share the same word in Samoan. Fatu is a Samoan word for rock and heart. In his powerful article, To Hell with Drowning, the Chamorro, which is from Guam, Chamorro human rights and environmental lawyer and writer Julian Argon has beautifully written about the trauma of dislocation as rising sea levels in the Pacific dispossesses local communities of their ancestral lands and homes. Writing about the first Fijian village called Vuni do Goloa, which had to move in 2014, Julian said, "When I spoke with Sali Olsi Ramatu, the village's headman, in July, he told me the move was hardest on the elders. In the months leading up to the relocation, they held prayer circles. They fasted. They readied themselves for the rupture of having to abandon their ancestral lands. In Fiji, as in many of our islands, the people were tethered to the earth, as enshrined in the concept of vanua, a word that means the land and the people at once. The villagers live and love and die on their lands, most of which they do not even own, not at least as individuals. Rather, theirs is a system of communal land ownership. They tend to their gardens, they bury their dead. They even bury their umbilical cords. So it is no surprise when, as about 30 families set out for a new site, some of the older women wailed as they walked. Perhaps, as Julian writes, that's a sound the sea makes when it rises, old women wailing. Thus, it would probably not surprise you that studies that have looked into loss of culture in the climate crisis show similar detrimental health and well-being impacts as those Indigenous communities that were dispossessed from their lands through violent removal in settlers' colonial societies. Further, the Pacific region has a third of the world's languages. Just let that sink in because I'm sure you don't know that statistic. It covers a third of the globe and has a significant proportion of the world's remaining biodiversity. We are not small or insignificant, but we have been rendered this way through a colonial lens which sought to belittle us from the beginning and continues to do so. These languages are threatened when communities are forced to move, and so is the immense universe that these languages represent. The climate crisis is also a global biocultural crisis. So the third and last point I want to make is about decolonising climate displacement is the point I made in the beginning. If we do not adequately and fearlessly diagnose the causes of what is driving the crisis for Pacific peoples, our solutions are not up to the task. As decolonial and environmental lawyers, we must be innovative and strategic in our approaches, recognising the forces that we are contending with are powerful. I'll provide you with one example. One of the tools of colonisation has been to devalue and belittle Indigenous peoples' culture, and the same occurred in the Pacific at the outset of colonisation. We were seen as unproductive, still the case, backwards, savage, and not economically important, and so on. These are narratives that also make us expendable. EDO has been working with a team of experts to provide a true value of subsistence lifestyles in the Pacific and so-called non-economic losses due to climate change. This will involve valuing the cultural labour that has kept ecological systems sustainable over millennia and lost inheritance value of these subsistence lifestyles in perpetuity due to climate change. It actually takes a lot of work to keep an environment sustainable and sustaining over the course of time. You would not be surprised that this will involve creating a novel methodology, but there are already other efforts to value Indigenous lifestyles and to put a price tag on these lifestyles. We expect that the true value will be substantial. In conclusion, it is important that environmental lawyers and human rights lawyers adopt an analytical framework that takes in colonisation and climate racism. Without doing so, we are not challenging the structures and processes which are driving this ecological crisis. In particular, climate displacement is unable to convey active processes of dispossession involved in the climate crisis. When we fail to point out the actors that are responsible for the crisis and end up repeating, as I've heard from lawyers over and over again, that we are all responsible for climate change, we are not. This active dispossession takes our precious lands and seas from us and threatens our culture, language and identities. It takes our cosmos and our place in the world. It is theft. It is colonial. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name's Professor Andrew Lynch and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of UNSW Law and Justice, and it's my great pleasure to give a vote of thanks tonight. Before I do so, I also add my own acknowledgement of country. We're in the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend a particular welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders in the audience today. And I reaffirm the Faculty of Law's commitment to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the work that some of my colleagues, a great number of my colleagues, have done towards that work, the invitation to walk with Indigenous Australians for a better future. I always love coming to a journal launch, and it's really the perfect evening out because you get to see lots of people that you might not have seen for a while and to have a lot of chat. There's drinks, there's food. And then there's intellectual substance, always provided by the journal itself, and I'll come to that in a moment, but also provided by the guest speaker. And the first of my duties tonight is to thank Fleur Ramsay for her really remarkable address tonight. It's been a fascinating, substantial and deep treatment of an issue which we talk about quite a lot, but perhaps not think about in the ways that Fleur has encouraged us to do tonight. I feel especially lucky because this is the second event that I've been with Fleur on behalf of the faculty in the last couple of months. And they've both been amazing nights. I feel I have been changed by both events, and they were quite different. The last one was a conversation with a number of other wonderful speakers. But tonight it's been 100% Fleur, and I really want to express gratitude for the careful way she has walked us through a series of very important, complex ideas. When she was talking about Patrick Wolf's work and colonisation as a structure and the elimination of the native, it was hard for me not to think about a similarly wonderful address I heard just on Friday night at the Australian Human Rights Commission Human Rights Awards, delivered by Professor Larissa Behrendt. And she spoke about those themes in connection with Australia's criminal justice system, its juvenile justice system for Indigenous Australians. And she spoke very powerfully about those problems through that lens of colonisation is something that we are living now. And the effects of it are all around us. It is not this point in time moment. To have that thinking so fresh in my mind transposed to the even more wicked problem of climate change, and I'm just going to use that expression at the moment, was really wonderful. And the parallels are very clear. But when Fleur also drew on the record from the various COPs over the years, that was quite powerful. And I was sitting here thinking, in my own lifetime, the language around climate has changed from, in the 1980s, hearing about the greenhouse effect, to then climate change, climate risk, climate emergency, climate displacement. And it may be that I don't read widely enough or get out enough, but here for the first time tonight, for me, climate dispossession. And I don't know if I'm alone, but I suspect I'm not. But to have that idea so brilliantly introduced to me, I won't forget it, and I won't forget where I was and who I heard that idea from as well. And it's going to be one that will just enter into our lexicon, as unfortunately the urgency around that becomes more and more acute. And I like the way, having introduced us to that concept, Fleur then proceeded to explain why it is so much more than displacement, what it means for culture, what it means for connection and self-identity. And as I say, there was so much in your speech, and thank you for the generosity with which you've shared those ideas with us, that we will keep thinking about them and probably keep coming back to them. And obviously, sadly, we will need to hear much more about them because those problems are very present. So I'd like everybody to join with me, please, to thank Fleur for her address. I also want to thank the faculty's friends at Cause Chambers Westgarth and welcome them as premier sponsors of the journal, and thank Andrew for his remarks earlier this evening. It's really wonderful to have Cause join with Herbert Smith Freehills, Allens Linklaters and King and Wood Mallisons to sponsor the journal. Cause are a wonderful firm and great friends to the faculty and support us across a number of endeavours. And it seems only fitting, really, to have them now join as supporters of the journal, which is such a key part of what the faculty does through its students and the contribution it makes to legal research in Australia. It's really wonderful, so thank you. I also want to thank and acknowledge my colleagues Rosalind Dixon and Gary Edmond for the support they provide to the journal. But now I turn to the journal itself, and the segue is to acknowledge the work of Ros and Gary, but to put it into perspective by explaining to everybody here, and I think this is obviously well understood by all the students, but whenever I come and hold a journal, it is reminded to me that it is an entirely student-run publication. And indeed, somebody asked me tonight and saying, oh, when was the earliest you saw this? And I said, well, just now when you saw me pick it up from the table. I've had nothing to do with it. I have no responsibility. All the responsibility has been on Georgia and the team around the journal. And people are always amazed by that. I am amazed by how professional and exacting the standards of the journal are, but I now expect nothing less from the students who edit it and create it. But it is really important. I want to say that I always feel like a guest at these events myself, because the journal is independently run and produced by students, and it is just the faculty's job to support and cheer them on. And we do so with great enthusiasm, because the journal is an enormous source of pride to all of my colleagues at the Faculty of Law and Justice. I now just want to briefly end by thanking Darius and the all 4 issue editors of the year. It's been my great pleasure to get to know them over the course of the year and see them work towards this point, the last issue of the volume that is 45 of the UNSW Law Journal. I congratulate those who will be coming aboard for volume 46. But I particularly want to acknowledge Georgia's contribution and achievement tonight in editing this. She did point out that she is the editor of the 4th issue, and I always feel a little bit sorry for the editor of the 4th issue because they are the marathon runner of the journal moment. I don't know if Carrie feels like she's the sprinter, but issue 1 brings its own pressures, I am sure. And indeed, issues 2 and 3 are not easy. No one has an easy ride, but the long haul that is issue 4 is certainly a significant thing. Well done, Georgia. Congratulations. Congratulations to all of the team. And my very last acknowledgement is to family members who are here. Family members also contribute to the production of the issue. You will have your daughter, son back now after this evening, your partner, your brother, your sister. It's a huge amount of time. Georgia estimated thousands of hours. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm easily outnumbered in this lab, but it's definitely a lot of hours. And we recognise that it's wonderful to have family come along to this because it is a huge achievement and well done. So thank you to all of those who are the outgoing team. Welcome to those who are incoming. Fleur, again, thank you so much for making this an especially memorable and important occasion. Good night.
Thank you, Professor Lynch, for that vote of thanks, and thank you, Ms. Ramsay, for that insightful keynote address. So with Volume 45, Issue 4 of the UNSW Law Journal officially launched, we have now reached the conclusion of tonight's formal proceedings. Please feel free to remain and mingle for the next half an hour or so, and please do not forget to collect a complimentary copy of Issue 45-4 if you haven't already. All of the articles in this issue can also now be found on the UNSW Law Journal's website. Thank you all for your attendance, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening.